So to end this lecture, this class, I want to throw out a few things that you can go do research on your own on these things. I'm not going to give an academic lecture on these items. It's not a history class, but there are a few things that you need to know a little bit more about, and that's kind of the whys behind what happened in Massachusetts and how things changed. Because of course, you look in Massachusetts today, and it's hardly a Puritan bastion. Some parts of Boston are downright scandalous. But it certainly isn't what it was 400 years ago. So the question, of course, is what changed and how did it change? Well, we don't have time to go in through 400 years of history. That's not what this slide is all about. But there are a couple of things that I think you need to be aware of. And one is something that deals with demography and with migration and these sorts of things. um, One of the things that Puritanism was a victim of is its own success in New England after these first settlements, Plymouth and Boston and Charlestown and Ipswich and Salem and all of these were established. More and more migrants came there in the 1630s. Of course, was called the Great Migration prior to the English Civil War. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Puritans moved there. They thrived there. They brought with them their industry and their talents, their skills, their farming abilities, and they grew, and the population grew. And as a result, think about it this way. I'm just going to simplify this in just really, really easy way to understand it. Suppose you're a Puritan couple and you have, I don't know, 6 or 8 children. You probably had 10 or 12, and not all of them survived, but let's suppose you had 6 or 7 children that survived to adulthood, and let's suppose that half of those were males. Well, you know how it was back in those days. Oldest male child inherited the farm. Youngest male child or middle male child had to go out and fend for himself and find a way to make a living. One way you could do that is go off to college and become either a minister or a doctor or a lawyer or a business person, something like that. That was fine, and wealthy families were able to do that. Some did, some didn't. Lower class families didn't do that, however. Or you could send your younger boy out to be an apprentice for a trade. Certainly Ben Franklin, that happened with him, and we'll get to that later. But if you want your kid to be a blacksmith or a shipwright or a carpenter or a bricklayer or whatever, you'd send them out to do that, and they'd do it for a couple of years. They'd get the skills that they needed, and they'd open up their own business. And with a growing population, skilled tradesmen were very, very much in demand, and so that was a fine thing to do. But if you were bent on being a farmer and you were the youngest or a middle boy, then you had to go and create a new farm, didn't you? Well, that was actually not a bad thing either, because if you didn't mind swinging an axe and getting behind a plow, what once was virgin forest could quite readily become fairly productive farmland, and a lot of it did. And it was easy to come by, and you always knew that civilization to the east of you had your back, and so a lot of people branched out. If you look at the drawing on the right, it's a typical town plan. There's not a lot of room to go find a new farm within a township like that, or within a county like that. It's already taken all up. So where are they going to go? They're going to go west. Go west, young man, right? So there is continued pressure for western migration, because a lot of the easy and cheap land to come by has already been taken back east. And as people move west, they're going to need tradespeople to come along with them. They're going to need educated people to come on out there with them. So the push was to go west. And in fact, the migration went so swimmingly and so thoroughly and so populously, if I can use that word, there was a problem. And the problem was that people were moving away from the towns that had been established just a few decades earlier at such a rapid clip that they were way out in the boonies and the hinterland. And many of them actually grew up to young adulthood not ever having attended a church. Seems kind of odd. You say, well, wait a minute, they were Puritans, weren't they? Well, yes, they were. They were Puritans. But if you live 20, 30, 40 miles away from the nearest town, that doesn't seem like a lot when you've got a car that'll go 70 miles an hour. But if you've got to hack your way through the wilderness, that's a long way. You didn't make it to church every Sunday. right? So the people who were living very, very far away, there was a problem, and the problem was that they didn't have the ability to come back into town very often for the kind of religious ordinances and ceremonies and such that their city brethren and sisters had the access to. So what do you do about that? Do you simply write them off as lifelong pagans who live out in the country and woe is them, they need to get their rear ends back into town? Well, no, you can't do that. So they come up with this thing called the halfway covenant. And that is that you will be considered a member of the church if your parents were a member and you, as a young person, have not been able to come and become confirmed and go through the religious process necessary for formal membership, as long as you've not been able to do that by distance or something. Right? It's more complex than that. I'm simplifying it grossly. But essentially it's a way of saying, well, we're going to consider the children of Orthodox, devout, confirmed Puritans to be Puritans if they've been prevented due to distance or what have you from getting into it. But the minute you're able to do it, you need to do it, right? Well, now this is a huge problem philosophically, theologically for a lot of the Puritans. They make this decision to do this in 1662, and it's a bit of an admission that the population was already sort of spinning out of the tight control of people like John Winthrop, right? Who wasn't around by then anyway. But what it shows is that the population was growing faster than the authorities were able to exert control over it. There's a wonderful book out there called Sex in Middlesex, and I can't remember the author right off the top of my head. You can Google it if you wish. Fascinating book because it chronicles sexual crimes and misbehaviors and misdemeanors in the county of Middlesex in Massachusetts, which you think, well, that's salacious. Well, it's not so salacious. It's mostly designed to make a point, and that is that it would appear that as the 17th century went on, sex crimes actually dropped in Massachusetts. Shockingly, they dropped. Well, that's not actually the case. What's actually the case is that because people moved farther away, there was an awful lot less reporting of crimes, and certainly a lot less people being a lot less of the case that people were being brought to justice for those crimes. So when you lived in a tight-knit community and everybody lived in Boston and you were blocks away, you knew who was misbehaving and who wasn't. When people were way out in the boonies, you might have the local sheriff come out and visit, or you might not, right? So, and a lot of other things in that book that I highly recommend you take a read. Very interesting stuff, like how the pregnancy rates went up about 9 months after military drills were held in local towns. Wonder how that happened. But it's a sign that by the latter decades of the 17th century, people were living in rural areas. They had less control over them by local magistrates and governors. The Puritan hierarchy just did not control what was going on to the same extent that they had earlier. And this is going to redound upon people in positions of authority. It's going to be something that really has an impact later on, because what you're going to have is a lot of these communities that spring up in the wilderness on the frontier who are going to say, why should we do what Boston tells us to do back there? I mean, I've never even been to Boston. What do I care about Boston? And so there's a real tension that's going on in the latter half of the 17th century that should we be doing this? After all, we founded the Puritan Church because we said you got to go by the rules. You've got to go through confirmation. Unlike Henry VIII, you can't just be a member because you're born a member. So there's a lot of hand-wringing over that. And there was a lot of acknowledgement that the Great Experiment was having to be modified in such a way that maybe it was betraying its principles. The end result, of course, was compounded by the fact that in 1662 there was a terrible drought, and some people took this, as you would think Puritans would take it, as a sign from God that the halfway covenant was a really, really, really bad thing. We were being punished for that. This latter era of the 17th century we're going to revisit, particularly when we look at the poetry, because there's a great deal of second and third generation Puritan thought about how the experiment was going in their lifetimes. Are we off the rails? Are we off track? Are we doing what we should be doing? And so on. So stay tuned for that for the next class lecture.